All right, the defense ready to call witness. Yes, sir.
Your Honor, the defense calls Sergeant Adam Creech.
Seated, state your full name, spelling your last.
Anthony Adam Creech. Creech is C-R-E-E-C-H.
Sergeant Creech, where are you employed?
I'm employed with the Lexington County Sheriff's Department.
And how long have you been at the Sheriff's Office?
10 years this August 24th.
And obviously you're a sergeant. Did you start off as a sergeant there?
No, I didn't. In my time at the Sheriff's Department, I began like most deputies do as a just slick sleeve patrol deputy. I moved through as a field training officer, a master deputy, a criminal investigator, and now I'm currently a sergeant in investigations. I currently supervise our special victims unit.
And so back in August, September of 2014, you were a detective back then?
In August of 2014, I was a detective. I believe I had been a detective for about 2 months, give or take. I was relatively brand new in that position.
And you were assigned this case at that point in time, correct?
I was on, the original report for this case was filed on September 3rd, 2014. It was assigned to me as a missing persons case on September 4th, 2014.
So it would be fair to say you were the chief investigating officer.
That is correct. I would be the chief investigator in this incident.
And as you said, you received this case on 9/4 of 2014, and at that point in time, it was just assigned to you as a missing persons case, correct?
That's correct. On September 4th, 2014, when I received this case for investigation, it was titled as a missing persons report. All indications at the time were that Mr. Jones and his children had possibly just left town. The initial reporting parties had no indications that they could state at the time that there were any concerns for anybody's safety.
And the initial reporting, I believe, came through Tim's father and maybe also a school?
A little bit of a complicated answer to that. So earlier that day on the 3rd, there was a welfare check called in by Beth Hauk. I believe she was the principal or assistant principal at Saxe-Gotha Elementary School, where Mara, Eli, and Matan all attended school. Then Master Deputy Nicholson and Constable Lawrence Markey had responded out there with Ms. Hauk and attempted to do a welfare check. Nobody was home. Later that same evening, Timothy Jones Sr. Called in and spoke to Sergeant Black, one of our West Region Patrol supervisors, and kind of explained what was going on. And he ended up calling Master Deputy Smith, who was a South Region supervisor on duty at the time, and he actually sent him to the home of Miss Kaiser. She was Amber Jones still back then, to file the initial missing persons report at Russell Rowe Road, I think was the street.
And that's how, in the end, it comes to you, correct?
Correct.
And so once you get the case, you begin to interview witnesses, friends, family, work, individuals such as that?
So initially, it's pretty typical in a missing persons case just to make some phone contact with family, coworkers. I spoke to, I believe it was
I think Jim McConnell.
Jim McConnell first.
He's the fellow from Intel.
Yeah, he would be Timothy's supervisor at Intel. And then I know in order, I then spoke with Timothy Jones Sr., and then I think the following day is when I first was able to make contact with Ms. Kaiser.
And after speaking with Jim McConnell, were you able to determine any type of relationship that Tim had with his children through him?
You give me a second.
Sure.
Mr. McConnell indicated to me that he believed Timothy's home life kept him pretty busy and pretty stressed, but he said ultimately that he believed Timothy loved his children.
I think his words were, loved his children immensely.
That is correct. That would be what I wrote.
And he put you in contact with, I guess, a Ben Wine.
Yes.
He was Intel Security, correct?
Yeah, so Mr. McConnell offered the services of Ben Wine with Intel's internal security. I guess he'd be kind of like internal affairs. Mr. Wine is a former law enforcement officer, and he just wanted to know that if there was anything they could do as a company to assist with this. Ultimately, he was able to review Timothy's work emails. I think they ended up reviewing like 12,000 emails. They didn't find anything that was of any interest to us. So that was really the extent of Mr. Wine's involvement.
Well, you say nothing interesting. There was something unusual about the fact that there, in those 12,000 emails, weren't any personal emails, correct?
Correct. Mr. Wine did note that there were no personal activity in his work email. I guess from his perspective, most employees would have had some kind of personal correspondences, even in their work email.
And just so court reporter knows, Wine is spelled, I believe, W-Y-N-E, correct?
Correct. W-Y-N-E.
And you attempted to make contact with Amber, but couldn't get in touch with her, correct?
Correct. I believe I left her a voicemail on the 3rd, and I was able to speak with her. The 4th, and I spoke with her on the 5th.
And you ended up speaking with Tim Sr.
Correct.
And you asked him about any issues about depression or mental illness with Tim.
I did.
And you eventually actually ended up driving to 2155B South Lake.
That is correct.
And you kind of looked around the residence.
I did. When I got to the residence, it was kind of like it had been at the welfare check. There were no vehicles there. When I went through the front door, it was unlocked. Just as a safety concern, I checked the residence, and there was no signs that anybody was currently staying in the home. In fact, it looked kind of disheveled, and sheets were missing off the beds, and it wasn't any apparent indication that anybody was staying there at the time.
And after you spoke with Amber, you kind of reached out to Georgia Tech, I believe, to see if Tim had an application there, correct? Or was pending enrollment, I guess.
That's correct. When I spoke to Amber, she did mention to me that he had possibly applied for Georgia Technical College, I guess, and I did confirm that through an admissions counselor.
But he had not completed that enrollment.
He had not completed that enrollment, no.
Let me jump forward a little bit to the 6th then. I guess you're at home when you get a call from the sheriff's office, front desk, front lobby, in reference to a call from Marty Patterson in Mississippi.
Correct. So it was a Saturday night. I wasn't working. I received a call from the front desk at the sheriff's department. Now I know that that would have been highly unusual. Back then I was so new to this that it didn't dawn on me that this was anything unusual. Sherry Falah was the front desk worker that night, and she told me that there had been a NCIC hit sent on the missing person case I had involving Timothy Jones and his 5 children. And she had a name and number for Under Sheriff Marty Patterson with the Smith County Sheriff's Department, requesting that I give him a phone call.
And you mentioned an NCIC hit under the missing persons. Someone's put in NCIC saying if they get pulled over, hey, call us, we've got questions, correct?
That would be correct.
And so you ended up calling the undersheriff.
I did. I called Under Sheriff Patterson, and he told me that a couple of his deputies had been working a traffic safety checkpoint and had stopped Mr. Jones, and upon determining that he was a missing person, they had asked him about his children. They said that they also had him detained for suspicion of DUI and possession of spice. And they said that when they asked him about his children, he had said initially he didn't have any children, which they were concerned because of the NCIC entry, and they had seen a diaper box in the vehicle with his name on it. While I was on the phone with Mr. Patterson, I could actually hear Mr. Jones, Timothy in the background speaking, and Under Sheriff Patterson actually relayed to his deputies while I was still on the phone to ask him again, and that's when the story changed. And he came back and said he had 3 children, but they were with friends in South Carolina.
And you put the undersheriff at some point in time, I guess, in contact with, at that point in time, your supervisor, Sergeant Lance?
Yes, actually, Sergeant Lance was not my direct supervisor. He was a supervisor on one of the other teams in the Major Crimes Unit that was actually on call that weekend. So I called then Sergeant Lance and told him what we had going on, what our concerns were, because when I had spoken with Under Sheriff Patterson, he had told me that there was an extreme smell of decomposition in the vehicle, and that he had concerns from his experience, what that possibly indicated with Mr. Jones saying that he didn't have any children. So I gave Sergeant Lance kind of a rundown of what I had done on the case up until this point. I ended up shooting him an email summary, and he said that he'd make some phone calls and they'd run down some stuff until we figure out what exactly was going on and whose ultimate law enforcement jurisdiction would be responsible going forward.
And that email summary contained information about Tim's mother.
It did. When I'd spoken to Timothy Jones Sr., he had told me that Timothy's mother had a history of mental illness and that he had always had suspicions that Timothy could potentially follow in her footsteps, and he'd always kept a close eye on him as a result.
And he thought that he might have or suffer from some type of undiagnosed mental illness.
Yes, he said that was a possibility.
And you relayed that information to Sergeant Lance.
That is correct.
And then at some point in time, you end up receiving photographs of some items out of Tim's vehicle, correct? Like receipts.
That's correct. So that initial conversation with Sergeant Lance would have been on September 6th, 2014. The following day, September 7th, 2014, I think it was about 2 in the afternoon, I had spoken to Sergeant Lance earlier that morning and Lieutenant Fryer, who was the next person over Sergeant Lance. About 2 o'clock, they said that they called me back and said that there had been a search warrant conducted on Timothy's vehicle down in Mississippi, and that as a result of that, they had taken some pictures of some receipts and some notes, and it was giving them reason to believe that if a crime had occurred, it had occurred in Lexington County. And at that point, they asked me if I'd go ahead and come in, even though it was my day off. And of course, I said absolutely. So I went to the sheriff's department and kind of briefed with everybody else who was there, and we did look at a series of notes and receipts from the vehicle.
And you list those in your report, or a number of those, correct?
I do.
And just to go over that, I guess there was a receipt or something indicated on September 1st of 2014 that Tim had been in Spartanburg.
That's correct.
And that on the next day, the 2nd, that he was in Athens.
That's correct, Athens, Georgia.
And then on the 3rd in West Columbia.
That's correct. That would actually be the Walmart, West Columbia specifically.
And then I guess later on the 3rd, Lake City, South Carolina.
Correct. That would be an Advance Auto Parts.
And then on the 4th in Camden, South Carolina.
Yes, that would be the L&W Mart that I believe we had the clerk testify.
Denise Atkinson.
Correct.
Spoken earlier. And then on the 4th, also in Orangeburg.
And that would be the Dollar General that's been spoken about previously.
And then later on the 4th, back in Lexington.
Correct. On the 4th, he had 2 back-to-back safe Federal Credit Union transactions.
And then on the 6th, I guess, in Alabama.
Correct. Bypass Food Mart in Greenville, Alabama at 8:18 that morning.
And then also on the 6th, Mississippi, I guess, Taco Bell.
Well, before that on the 6th, at 1:06 p.m., he was at the Community Neighbor Bank in Camden, Alabama. And then it's 6:09 p.m. that same night, he had a receipt for the Taco Bell in Laurel, Mississippi.
And then just looking at those, you kind of thought, hey, there doesn't appear to be a rhyme or reason while he's traveling back and forth to the Lexington area during that time frame, correct?
Yeah, our initial impressions based on what we knew or didn't know at the time, we didn't really know if there was a pattern or not a pattern to him going back and forth.
And now, at that point in time, I mean, you had no idea that the kids were deceased.
No, I mean, based on what was described to me about the vehicle, realistically, I wasn't hopeful. I was prepared for the worst, but hoping for the best.
And we know now that the kids are in the car that entire time.
Yes, the children would have been in the car that entire time. In fact, they would have still been in the vehicle when the missing person report was filed and when it was assigned to me for investigation.
And based on those driving, that's just the receipts out of the car. I believe y'all supplemented them later with some phone records, correct?
Correct.
And so after you get all that, I think your next step is once you have these receipts to kind of reach out to other areas and say, hey, can I get video or something showing the person there, like with Miss Atkinson, like with Miss Owens, correct?
Yes, I made contact with investigators at several sheriff's departments throughout the state in South Carolina and Georgia in reference to possible surveillance video, and other detectives working in the case, some of which have already testified, were responsible for later meeting up with those individuals and actually getting copies of that video.
And then on the 7th also, you have another conversation with Amber, correct?
I do. So to backtrack and not leave anything out, since we're going fairly chronologically, I'd spoken to Amber on the 5th, and she said that she was going to go to their scheduled child visitation at Chick-fil-A on Saturday the 6th, and she had called me later that day, left me a voicemail
Said he hadn't shown up.
to say he hadn't shown up, and so I spoke to her again on the 7th when we had this new information developing, correct?
And you would ask her about Tim's prior mental health history, correct?
I did. She said that she believed he had possibly seen a psychiatrist at one point in South Carolina. I'd find out later that that was related to their divorce, and she said he may have received some kind of treatment for what she used the word bipolar disorder, but she said she ultimately wasn't sure. And she did mention that at that same time that he had a history of cocaine abuse.
You ended up on the 8th, you and Agent Mackey and Dave Lawrence from SLED, the decision was made for y'all to go to Mississippi, correct?
That's correct. Dave Lawrence with the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, he was the lieutenant then. Myself and Special Agent David Mackey, who testified on Friday, the three of us got selected to drive down to Smith County and try to interview Timothy. The local law enforcement had tried to interview him the night before and felt like they hadn't really gotten anywhere, and so we were going to drive down and try again. So at that time, we still believed that if a crime had occurred, it had probably occurred in Lexington County at his residence.
And Agent Lawrence is a polygrapher with SLED.
He was trained as a polygrapher. I don't think that was his primary duty assignment. He did bring his polygraphy equipment in case we decided to use it, but it's pretty unusual for us to actually use polygraphy equipment in most criminal investigations.
And to get to Mississippi, about an 8-hour drive, I'm guessing?
Yeah, I remember it being somewhere 8-9 hours. It was a pretty lengthy drive.
And y'all kind of made plans on what you're going to do when you get down there, correct?
And we discussed quite a bit amongst ourselves, and of course, with a case like this, everybody back home was like you had kicked over a fire ant bed. My phone, I don't know if it went 5 minutes without going off with somebody calling to tell me something or ask me something or give some kind of direction on the case. While we were on the way, we did formulate some general ideas of what we planned to do with the interview once we got down there.
And then once you got to Mississippi, you kind of got a briefing on what had gone on, correct?
We did. When we got down there, we kind of had a roundtable discussion with the Smith County Sheriff's Department personnel that were involved in the case and the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation personnel involved in the case. And I believe Special Agent Bobby that testified yesterday was also in that briefing.
And then I think after that briefing, you went out and you kind of reviewed the vehicle, or you went to the multi-purpose building and reviewed the vehicle yourself?
I did. Stacy Jones that testified last week with the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation, their forensic technician back then, she did drive me to where they were keeping Timothy's vehicle so that I could review it and all the evidence retrieved from the vehicle in this case.
And you were going to interview Tim, but you decided you weren't going to use his dad in that interview, correct?
Correct. We knew that his dad had been used the night before in that interview. We had talked about that on the way down there, but that was not anything we ever planned because it's a highly unusual interview tactic. I guess you could call it using a third-party intermediary. We didn't see where that was necessarily productive the night before, so we didn't plan on repeating that.
And you sat down with Tim at about 7:30.
Yes, I do believe it was about 7:30
And that's Central Time there, correct?
Central Time, yes.
And Tim didn't initiate that interview. Y'all went and got him.
That is correct.
And I think on the way to Mississippi, you had stopped and gotten a little handheld recorder, correct?
Correct. So this is something we'll talk about again here shortly, but just a little bit of background. So in 2014, it was not a standard practice for us to video or audio record interviews. Again, I'd only been in investigations a couple of months, so I was pretty early with this, but I knew had been done enough to know that that was not normal procedure at the Sheriff's Department at the time. We were about halfway into this trip, and I'd received a call from Lieutenant Fryer telling me to record the interview. We weren't sure what kind of recording capabilities the Smith County Sheriff's Department would have available, so we did stop at a local Walmart on the way and purchased a digital tape recorder.
And you told Tim, once you met him, that you were going to record the interview.
Correct. We did tell him that we were going to record the interview because we weren't sure at the time if Mississippi was a one-party consent state.
And you presented him his advice of rights.
That's correct.
And someone, I think it was Mackey, who went over that with him.
Yes, Special Agent Mackey, I believe he testified to this Friday. He went over the advice of rights form, and Timothy acknowledged it, agreed to speak with us, and I believe his words were, yes, I know I'm self-incriminating myself. He agreed to speak with us. We started speaking. There's a lot of small talk, what we'd call rapport building, about employment, jobs, health, just kind of dropping the tension, building a rapport with him before we jumped into the topic. About 20 minutes or so into that interview, the Miranda form had been sitting in front of him, and he reached forward and pulled it. He signed it.
And during the course, I mean, you interviewed him multiple times, correct?
That's correct, probably more than anybody else in this case.
And, well, you're the chief investigating officer, so that would be pretty much normal, wouldn't it?
It would.
And at times, while he was speaking, his speech could be kind of fast.
It could. He and I talked about it at one point. He mentioned to me that people felt like he was kind of a fast talker. I never had any issues keeping pace with him, but I'm got a tendency to be a fast talker too. In fact, I have to make a conscious effort not to get too fast today.
Sometimes he could kind of go off on a tangent or talk about something that was kind of irrelevant.
He could. Sometimes you'd be talking about topic A and he may stray into topic B, but I found usually you could kind of keep him on task if you paid attention to that.
And I think we even heard on the tape at one point in time he kind of stutters.
I've heard mention that he stutters. Again, that's something I'm prone to as well, so I don't know that I would have paid particular attention to him stuttering.
And during the interview, I know you got a typewritten report, but you took handwritten notes also, correct?
I would have had handwritten notes at one point, yes.
And that's what you used to turn in your report.
That is correct.
And I would assume normal protocol, you would have shredded those notes after you put them in your report.
Correct. I don't keep any of my handwritten notes, but everything gets translated into my report.
And I think your report indicates that you tried to start the recording after you had gone over his waiver.
Correct. So we tried to start the recording early in the interview. Then as the interview proceeds, we speak with Timothy at some length, as Special Agent Mackey testified to. After some initial denials and beating around the bush, Timothy finally admits that he did kill the children and goes into some intimate details about what took place. And we talk about that for a while, and actually after that, we had gone back and forth with him at some length trying to parse out what the location may have been. We had determined it was in Alabama between Camden and Greenville. Shortly after we had kind of gone through all that, we realized at that time that we needed to check the recorder. And to my embarrassment to this day, we thought it had been running the whole time, but it actually had not ever been turned on properly. But it was the first time we'd ever used it, and I know my nerves were through the roof, but I'll take the blame for that.
And that was about an hour and 45 minutes into the interview, correct?
That sounds about correct, yes.
Because it was about a 2.5-hour interview total, and we know we've got about 45 minutes that are taped.
That's correct.
Let me jump back then, and you kind of mentioned this. You kind of started off with asking him about his job, correct?
That's correct.
And he seemed to be engaged when he was talking about his job, especially kind of the technical minutia.
Yeah, so when we initially entered the room, he was I can't remember, he was brought in after we were in the, actually, I believe we were in there already, deciding where we were all going to sit. He got brought in. He was clearly very nervous. I actually think I describe him as on edge. So he sat down. So right off the bat, I knew that we weren't going to jump right into talking about the kids because he didn't seem like he was in a place where I believed we were at a point to have that kind of rapport with him where he'd open up to us about that. So a lot of times in interviews like this, when I get a read like that on somebody, the first thing I'm going to do is talk to them about work or their family. Obviously, family is kind of not a great topic in this case. But general things do just kind of get to know him a little bit. And when we started talking to him about work, his nervousness dropped considerably. It obviously relaxed him a little bit when we didn't jump straight into talking about the children.
That seemed to calm him down, make him more comfortable.
Absolutely.
And then I believe you kind of talked about his general health. I think you talked about some stomach problems or Crohn's disease.
We did. He told me he might have Crohn's disease and talked about some GI issues.
And you know from looking at the car that I guess there were some medicines or that related to issues like that.
Correct. I think there were some general antacids and that type of medication in the vehicle.
And at some point in time, the issue of spice came up, didn't it?
It did. I don't remember if he brought it up or we brought it up, but the topic of non-prescription drug use came up, and he mentioned that he did use spice, and then he went to great lengths to explain to me that the difference between spice and marijuana, and he explained how spice contained an artificial version of THC, and he went to an explanation about how it affected receptors on the human brain. It was probably the first time I've ever had somebody get into a breakdown of the biological effects of drugs and the chemistry up behind it, so I thought that was pretty unusual.
I think your report said that he didn't use spice, he used Scooby snacks, which he somehow differentiated.
Yeah, so yeah, and I apologize, let me clarify. He did say Scooby snacks, which he made a point to distinguish from spice. I mean, they're one and the same,
Yeah,
really.
6 1/2
They're
dozen.
both artificial cannabinoids.
Sorry.
Okay. See, I told you I had a tendency to speak fast.
Kind of 6 1/2 dozen of another, but that spice moniker seemed kind of bugging that I wasn't using spice, I was using Scooby snacks.
It did, and I'd had enough experience dealing with spice as a patrol deputy, which I had just been very recently prior to this, and spice and bath salts were both pretty prevalent at the time, so I was familiar with both.
And he told you he purchased them from Time Warp legally.
That's correct. Time Warp is where he said he purchased his Scooby Snacks from, which is a local establishment that used to be in West Columbia.
And that was something that you were familiar with Time Warp.
I was, because when we were dealing with spice pretty heavily, I believe that was one of the main locations a lot of people were purchasing it from.
And that place has been put out of business since then.
I do believe it has.
And the fact that the Scooby snacks were legal seemed important to him, didn't it?
Yes, he went to very specific lengths to explain that Scooby Snacks was illegal, even if spice in general was not, because at the time the laws were having trouble keeping up with the artificial cannabinoids on the market. I think as some experts explained, they were a number of versions in, and once one version would become illegal, they would tweak it a little bit until it was technically a different compound with similar effects, and then it would be remarketed. And I guess Scooby Snacks was the current rendition of that was available locally.
And he told you that he used the Scooby snacks to kind of self-medicate himself.
He did. His exact words were that he used it for self-medicating, what he referred to as the, quote, voices in my head, and he said it was used to level himself out.
And he said also, I think like you said, he used it to quell the voices in my head.
Yeah, quell wasn't his word. That was my word in the report, but it was same context.
And y'all talked about some of his mother's psychological problems, didn't you?
That's correct. And he brought this up. And I had known from the night before when they interviewed him on the 7th that he had brought his mother up during the interview. And of course, I had the background from Timothy Sr. that had been brought up during the interview. At this time, when myself and Special Agent Mackey were speaking to Timothy, he did bring up his belief that he may have inherited psychological problems from his mother. And when he talked about his mother, he got very, very emotional and very, at least appeared to be upset. And whereas the work topic calmed him down, this topic very much amped him back up. And he said, quote, "I think I've got some of what she has," end quote.
And he had mentioned to you that she had had a series, apparently, of breakdowns when she was near his age.
I don't remember if I can attribute that to Timothy or his father, but one of them did tell me that she had had a series of psychological breakdowns at Tim's age.
And at some point in time, I guess he told you if you could find out what was wrong with her, that you might be able to find out what's wrong with him.
Correct. And as I'm looking here to back up on that last question, Timothy did tell me this. I think I ended up hearing it from both of them at one point. Yeah, and I didn't see it just now.
And as you said, that the topic of his mother seemed to upset you.
Correct. And I'll note, just because we're a little out of order here, this is about when he pulled the Miranda form to himself and signed the form.
And when you say upset him, does that mean he's crying?
I believe, if I remember, there's a little bit of crying. It was certainly his speech pattern changed a bit. His voice broke a little bit. Certainly, he had been a fairly calm demeanor up until that point.
Bless you. And as you said, at that point in time, he kind of takes the form and signs it.
Correct. And he once more, as he's signing it, told us that he knew he was incriminating himself.
And that was about 20 or 30 minutes in, wasn't it?
Correct.
At that point in time, y'all bring up the children, don't you?
We do. We started to ask him about the children, kind of like talking about his mother. This topic upset him quite a bit as well. His voice began to waver again. I do know he was crying a bit at this point.
Crying heavily at that point.
Crying heavily. His body language, he had been fairly calm after initially coming in. That initial nervousness, his body language had kind of leveled out. But at this point, he starts, I guess, vibrating, for lack of better terms, and kind of bouncing, almost like when you're dealing with somebody who's nervous about something and they're trying to expel all that nervous energy. But that was his reaction once we start speaking about the children.
And y'all end up talking about Natan, correct? And him telling you about being afraid?
Correct. So when we started speaking about the children, he told us that he was afraid of the children. And he said he had picked the oldest three children, which again would be Elias, Mara, and Natan, up from school on the afternoon of Thursday, August 28th, 2014. And he said he had picked up the youngest two children from his neighbor, Christina Elke's house. He said at home later that night, he said that his son Natan had threatened him, and threatened was his word. And the statement he attributed to Natan was, "When I grow up, I'm going to kill you." And then he told me that his son Elias said, "I'm going to," quote, "going to cut people up and feed them to dogs." And then, I was going to say, he started telling us about Natan messing with electrical outlets in the home, and he believed that Natan was, quote, "up to something," end quote.
And you challenged him at that point in time and said, "They're just kids. How could they pose a danger to you?"
Not exactly. So, fast forwarding a little bit, we'd be kind of getting.
Report say in that next paragraph, I asked Timothy how his children could pose a danger to him.
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm getting my own head ahead of things with some other statements that come in later.
We'll go through them.
Yeah, he did say that. I did ask him that, how the children could pose a danger to him.
And he told you that the kids were extremely intelligent.
He said they were extremely intelligent, and then he referred to the recent incident. Turned out there was an incident report with the Sheriff's Department that's been brought up, where his youngest son, Gabriel, had walked away from the babysitter's house and been caught going up South Lake. They think maybe he was going to Saxcoff Elementary School. Timothy said this was not normal behavior for a 2-year-old, and he said this was an example of how intelligent the children were.
and that's why they posed a danger to him.
Yes, and he said this was a reason that he felt they posed a threat to him.
And he told you that he thought that the kids were conspiring to kill him?
Yes, he did. He said that he believed that they were conspiring to kill him on the night of August 28, 2014, and then he said that that's why he drove them to Walmart, the nearby Walmart, which would be the Walmart Red Bank, and said he abandoned them in the parking lot and then drove away.
And he had also told you that he thought that maybe Natan was up to something and was possibly experimenting with the electricity as a possible means to electrocuting in his sleep.
Yes, he referenced that the issue with the outlets, he believed that it was Natan attempting to find a way to electrocute him in his sleep.
And so, after that, that's when Agent Mackey kind of said, hey, I believe you killed those children, and kind of confronted him, correct?
That is correct. David Mackey, for the first time in the interview, gave a very direct accusation, and he said, I believe you killed those children. Timothy was surprised at this. It was like he didn't know how to respond to this. There was kind of a brief moment of silence, and after that, his behavior started to amp up again. He got more erratic. He tried to change the topic, which seemed very evasive. This was, it was like he didn't want to talk about this once confronted with it. Special Agent Mackey and I both remained very calm and focused and kind of kept him on that path because we weren't going to let him change the topic and not get into this at this point.
He was raising his voice. He was saying very loudly how afraid he was of the children, correct?
Yes, he was saying he was afraid of the children. But after a few minutes of us not reacting to the outburst, he started to calm down noticeably.
Well, you describe it as pretty wild behavior, don't you?
Correct.
And in fact, you believe that it was similar to the behavior you heard about the night before. Isn't that correct?
Yes, they had described his behavior as being kind of wild and erratic the night before. I wasn't there, so I don't know, exactly to what level, but the way they described it, this seems probably the closest to that I saw during my encounters with Timothy.
And he had been in custody there for, I guess, a couple of days or close to it?
Yeah, a couple of days, give or take. That sounds about right.
And he's crying at this point in time.
He is.
And at that point in time, Agent Mackey he went over those receipts that y'all had found out of the car.
Correct. He was confronted with the Walmart receipts. When he was confronted with things like the muriatic acid specifically and the saws, he said the saws were for cutting limbs in the yard, and he said the muriatic acid was for etching PVC. He kind of had an explanation for everything that was on the receipt.
And y'all had showed him the handwritten notes also, correct?
We did, and he actually very quickly acknowledged that was his handwriting. We had him read the notes out loud. And what was notable is he read the notes and he didn't seem to show any reaction or response to what was written on the notes. It was just a very flat tone, like he wasn't surprised about the content.
And you actually even confronted him with kind of the biological evidence, in other words, the blood that y'all had found. Correct.
So the notes, Special Agent Mackey dismissed the explanation for the notes in these his explanations for the Walmart items, and said he believed they were for getting rid of bodies. And then I confronted Timothy with the blood that was found in the vehicle. As previous witnesses have testified to, there was a lot of blood in the vehicle, a lot of signs of decomposition. He had previously told the officers the night before that it was possibly from an animal. When we confronted him about it on the 8th, he similarly said it was from an animal. Now, I had known from speaking with Stacey Jones earlier that day that they already outsourced some of the biological samples to a local lab called Boscale's Biolab, and they had gotten some presumptive tests indicating that the material was human. So I confronted Timothy with this after he said it was probably from an animal, and he quickly said, oh, it's from a cut. Other than the fact that he didn't have any cuts that we could see, a cut wouldn't account for that sheer level of blood in the vehicle. And I confronted him with that. I told him that there was enough blood in the vehicle that couldn't have been from a cut. And he acknowledged it and didn't say anything else about it.
And at that point in time, you kind of changed tactics and started to emphasize self-defense while you were speaking with him, didn't you?
We did, or I did specifically, and there's a little bit of background on that. So one of the people we had spoken to over the phone on the way down for this interview was a behavioralist with SLED, and he had kind of given us a range of suggestions and ideas of how to approach the interview and topics to bring up. And one of the things that he had suggested was to offer a minimized explanation for what had happened, because we knew that the children were probably dead, and if they were dead, he had probably killed them. And that's a hard thing to get somebody to admit to in an interrogative setting. So one of the suggestions was to throw out this, especially since he was already setting a foundation that he was afraid of the children. He thought they were going to try to harm them. So I tried to throw out self-defense as a very direct offer. And I went through a pretty detailed explanation about, I think I specifically told him that we had no doubts he had killed them, and that if he killed them, he had to have had a good reason. And I quoted the Protection of Persons and Property Act. I kind of oversold it a little bit, and a little bit of that was on purpose because I wanted to gauge his reaction. And he actually got a pretty, I described it as a disgusted tone, and he almost kind of looked perplexed and cocked his head, and he said, "But they're just kids."
And so you disregarded that at that point in time?
Yes, in my opinion, I believe that indicated to me that the fear of the children wasn't as significant as he was claiming it was.
Well, and you started to talk with him about a lot of the major life stressors and how someone in his position with 5 children could easily become overwhelmed, didn't you?
Correct, and that was another level of rapport building on my part, is I keyed in on that pretty early, that who wouldn't be stressed in that situation, having 5 children and in a high-stress tech job and being a single parent. So I tried to use that to kind of further our interactions and rapport with them, and kind of use that to kind of bring the stress levels down a little bit more as well, since they had kind of raised back up at this point.
And you say bring his stressful levels down, but he was very emotional at that suggestion, wasn't he?
It was emotional in a less erratic way. It seemed to strike a chord with him. Like he kind of shook his head in acknowledgement of what I was saying, you know.
And he was crying.
And he was crying a little bit at that point.
And you actually told him, "Hey, I'm not there to judge you. We're simply trying to find out, understand what happened to the children and find them, so that they can properly be put to rest," didn't you?
That's correct.
At that point in time, I believe Agent Mackey starts placing photos in front of him, doesn't he?
He does. I believe the photos are in evidence, and they're the photos that have been put in the media quite a bit on this case. But they were the initial photos that I'd been given as part of the missing persons report. And Special Agent Mackey had started putting those pictures down in front of him, and he got really upset over being presented with those pictures, actually raised up in his chair quite a bit. He's handcuffed in the front, so there's not a whole lot of movement he can do, but he actually rose up several inches and got really hysterical and was yelling to keep them away from him. And
He's coming out of the chair. He's sobbing hysterically. He's saying, "Keep them away from me."
Correct. And at that point, Special Agent,
Okay. He genuinely appears to be terrified.
he's behaving that way.
You don't put in your report that Timothy appeared to be genuinely terrified of the photographs of his children?
His behavior was indicative of that.
And you showed him Defendants 102 at that point in time, did you not?
I did.
And when you showed him that photograph, what did you say to him?
So this is the only one of the pictures that Timothy was depicted in, and this is with, I believe this is Gabriel in the photo. I showed him that picture, and at this point, I'd kind of keyed in that Special Agent Mackey was kind of the more direct, kind of bad cop, if you will, even though I, think he seems like a pretty nice guy. But it's just that image, federal agent. He's the one getting in there saying, "You killed him. You did this. You did this." I'm taking a more understanding, kind of patient, non-demeaning approach. So I'm kind of inserting myself as kind of the good cop of the scenario. So when this picture came up, what I exactly said, I quoted this to myself, as I said, quote, "Tim, you know what this picture shows me? This shows me a man who obviously loves his children, and if he killed them, he did it because he felt like he had no other choice at the time." Again, trying to give him sort of a hook to minimize what took place and start to tell us what happened.
Well, he's sobbing heavily at this point in time, isn't he?
He is.
And at some point in time, he kind of says, "Hey guys, let's just cut to the chase."
Correct. So Special Agent Mackey immediately went into confronting him with the Walmart receipts again. And Tim was still crying quite a bit. And just one of the wildest things I've ever seen in terms of a demeanor shift. It was like you would flip the light switch, and he just completely calmed down, and he very calmly, he said, quote, "Guys, let's cut to the chase." And we asked him what he meant, and he said, "You're not going to find them." We asked him why, and he said, "Because they're deceased."
And you told him that you need to understand what happened so you can find the children, correct?
Correct. And that had been another strategy that had been suggested by the SLED behavioralist, that if we could get him to talk about what happened to the children, that one of the big things we needed to push was that we needed to find the children so that we could bring them back home, get them a proper burial, put them to rest, which, I mean, I think that's where we would have gone anyways, because it would have been the appropriate thing to do under the circumstances.
And Tim told you after he said that, he said, "Guys, this wasn't premeditated."
That's correct. That was his quote that I attributed to him, was "This was not premeditated."
And if I understand, none of this is recorded at this point in time. You don't know that it hasn't been recorded.
No, the recorder was off to the side, and at an angle it looked like the red light was on, but it was just a reflection of the light in the room.
Coming through the red,
Yeah.
I don't know, the button or whatever
Yeah.
the glass plastic. And he told you about basically Natan and the outlets, blowing the outlets, correct?
Yeah, he went on to talk about Natan and the outlets again in a little bit more detail. He said that he believed Natan was, quote, up to something and, quote, wouldn't come off it, so he, quote, PT'd his ass.
And when we say PT, we're talking about exercising.
Yes, he described it specifically like push-ups and squats, and then he later used the word hitting and spanking as well.
And when he says wouldn't come off of it, he wouldn't admit why he had blown the outlets. That's what we're talking about when we say he wouldn't come off of it.
Correct. It was talking about the outlets, and he said he pushed the child for hours because he wouldn't tell him about the outlets.
And he went over with you how Natan died.
Yes, he said he had pushed him for hours, and he said, I quote, pushed him too far, and he said he sent him to bed and claimed that he later went to check on him and said he was deceased.
And at that point in time, Mackey says to him, "Hey, this isn't about Natan not coming off of it, correct?"
Correct. Special Agent Mackey says, quote, this was not about you being afraid of your children. This is about Natan not coming off of it. Timothy's response was yes. And then Timothy said this was all because Natan would not come off of it.
But with Natan not coming off of it, we're talking about Natan not coming off of playing with the outlets in an attempt to electrocute his dad, correct? I mean, that's what he's trying to get out of him, is why are you doing this?
So Timothy had earlier referenced, obviously when he first brought up the outlets, that it was because of his fear Natan was trying to hurt him. He didn't bring it up, that angle up at this point. He just seemed really focused on the fact Natan wouldn't tell him what happened to the outlets and why. He actually used the word defiant to describe the child when he was talking about the PT. And then there's a really odd statement. At one point he says, quote, 1 out of the 5 would have grown up to do something bad. Me killing them prevented that.
And that seemed really odd to you, didn't it?
Of course.
But you took it as him implying that maybe the kids would grow up to have some sort of mental illness?
I did. That was my impression at the time.
And that seemed odd.
It did. I don't think that's a good rationalization for what took place.
And at that point in time, he kind of took you through, when you asked about the other children, he told you how he had strangled them.
Correct. He went into a detailed explanation then that you guys have all heard about how he strangled the other 4 He said he started with Elias. As he was strangling Elias, he said that Elias said, quote, "Daddy, I want to go with," end quote. And then he told us next he sought out Mara, who he then told us he also manually strangled with his hands. And while doing this, as it's been previously testified to, she said, quote, "Daddy, I love you," end quote. And he had initially told us he killed the youngest two children, the babies, the same way. Later, he clarified for us that he had actually used a belt. When we asked him what belt, his response was, "I don't know, I have a lot of belts." But he did admit that when he did kill the children, it was on August 28th, 2014, and it was at his residence, which was 2155B South Lake Drive, which is in Lexington.
And but he still seemed uncertain regarding Natan's exact cause of death. What he expressed to you.
He did. I've noted at the time that I felt like it was kind of unusual that he'd be so blatant about how the four died, but he wouldn't explain Natan. Looking back on it, I can see a number of reasons that could be the case. At the time, he suggested that maybe Natan had electrocuted himself with the outlets, and he actually used the word, quote, "sucked all the electrolytes out of his body," end quote. He's a pretty intelligent guy. In hindsight, I don't see where he would have necessarily believed something like that, but that was his suggestion at the time.
But you had placed in your report, Timothy seemed genuinely uncertain regarding Natan's exact cause of death.
That was my impression in that moment.
And he told you how after that he had smoked Scooby snacks to kind of calm the voices in his head.
He did. So we initially spoke about the message he had sent his father. I think it was introduced yesterday about he had too much to do, and that's why he wasn't coming into town that weekend. Whether or not that referred to what to do, his dilemma over what to do with the children, and he said yes. And then he went on to tell us this was also why he told his neighbor Christina on the 2nd that she couldn't talk to him, because at that point, of course, they were already deceased. He then told us at that point that he had smoked the Scooby snacks that he mentioned that he uses after killing the children, and he said it was to, quote, "calm the voices in his head."
And he had told you how he'd wrapped the children in sheets and blankets and placed them in his car.
He did. He said he used the sheets and blankets off their beds, and he wrapped them up and stacked them in the vehicle.
And you had asked him, what were you thinking at the time? And he said, I wasn't thinking, I didn't care if I got caught.
Yeah, that's correct. He did say, I quoted him with this, "I wasn't thinking, I didn't care if I get caught." We talked about whether or not he had ever done anything to any of the bodies, which he denied. But he did make the comment at that time that he was, quote, "not very careful with them because they were already dead."
And you asked him, hey, with all this going on, why didn't you get any help? He kind of mistook that question, didn't he?
Correct.
In other words, he started telling you that Amber didn't want the kids and that he kind of had a rocky relationship
Yeah, I just
with the dad.
glancing at this. No, I didn't want to misspeak. So we did ask him if, so initially, he made a comment about what he thought should happen to him, and he mentioned a couple possibilities that I'm not going to say. And in light of this, I did make the comment, he did make the comment of, "I think I need help." And then he went on to explain to us that this wasn't the first time he had thought about harming the children. And we had asked him as a follow-up, why he didn't previously seek any help. And at the time, he seemed to interpret that as physical help with the children, like child care type stuff, because then he went on to explain that he had a rocky relationship with his own father and family, and that, he at least insinuated that the children's mother didn't want to be an active part in their lives.
And you told him, no, that's not what we were talking about. You were talking more mental health kind of stuff.
Yes, I was inquiring more of the potential psychiatric issues, if those were valid. And his response was, quote, "because I thought I could manage it on my own." And he mentioned at that time about how he had seen a psychiatrist briefly after his divorce. And during that, we kind of asked him what his thoughts were about what happened to the children. And to me, this was a pretty notable statement of his. He said, quote, "part of me says I'm their father and no father should do this to his children. And part of me says, fuck it, they're already dead."
And he had also told you that he had been told numerous times that he needed psychiatric help.
He did.
And he told you, or y'all explored about the fact that the children were in the car from August 28th until September 6th, correct?
That's correct.
And that he drove around with him in the car no matter where he went.
That's correct. He said he was driving around. I believe he described it as fairly aimless, but he said at the time he was trying to come up with ideas and plans of what he was going to do with the bodies.
And you thought that that was fairly consistent with what you had seen of the vehicle, about the kids being in the car.
Oh, correct. The vehicle was definitely indicative that they had probably been in there for a week.
And y'all went back and talked to him about, say, the Walmart receipt and some of the notes, didn't you?
We did. We went back and talked with him about the items from the receipt again, and this time he did acknowledge that he had purchased all of those things from the Walmart and that his intent had to be to use those items to dispose of the children. His exact word was, quote, dispose of the evidence. He said that he had purchased the garbage bags so the Walmart purchase was on the 3rd. The garbage bags from Dollar General were on the 4th. He said those were specifically purchased to get rid of the remains. Notably, he said, quote, I had some of my own trash to throw away too, end quote. And then we asked him about the smell because some other witnesses have testified the smell in this vehicle was pretty significant. And his comment to us was that you just learned to ignore that after a while.
That smell would knock you off your feet, even when you...
When I was exposed to it, it had been airing out for a couple of days, and yeah, about knock you off your feet.
But he also told you that those kind of plans that had been formulated, that he just couldn't follow through with.
He did. He said ultimately he just put the children in garbage bags and tossed them off a wooded access road.
And you told him at that point in time what he did was terrible, but you also told him again that it wasn't your place to judge him for what he did.
That's correct. I did tell him that. Again, he said this. He's admitted to what most people would agree is a pretty egregious thing. But at that point, my goal at this point is that we've still got to find those children and bring them home. So I can't get emotionally invested and reactive to what he's just admitted to. I've got to stay in my role. And so, again, the empathetic approach to this interview, and again, it's not my role to judge him for what he did. It's just to be a finder of what happened, and let's find those children, let's get them home.
And that's what you told him is, hey, we need to find the children and that they deserve a proper burial.
I did. I once more harped on the notion that he needed to help us put these children to rest, which is what they deserve. They deserve better than being thrown in garbage bags in the woods.
And Tim wanted to help you find them and put them to rest, didn't
He did. I mean, he agreed with us that what he had done wasn't what they deserved. And I think at the very least, he realized that at this point he had admitted to what he had done and that there's no reason for him not to help us find the children.
And in fact, he even seemed eager, didn't he?
Yes, I would say that the more involved we got in trying to find the location, he did get very, very engaged and very eager for us to find the spot and take us to the children.
And you told him that confessing and helping to find the kids was the right thing to do.
I did.
And so y'all kind of, at that point in time, kind of tried to, I guess, kind of step back in time and start figuring out kind of where the kids might be.
We did. So there's kind of a key incident that I think occurred, at least he says it occurred, and I think this is of significance to the timeline of what happened is he had mentioned this to the officers on the night of the 7th. I don't know if it came up in their testimony or not. I can't remember. But Timothy's told us at this point, he repeated this story, that on the night of September 6th, he was driving through Georgia or Alabama, and he pulled over on the side of the road, and he got stuck in a ditch. He said that he should have been caught then because he said a local law enforcement officer got out with him and was concerned that he might have been under the influence, and they kind of had a loose suspicion of possible DUI. He said there was a homeowner, I guess a residence right there where he got stuck in the ditch. He'd come out and talked to him already and came out and vouched for him and said, hey, look, this guy's not a problem. Just let him call a tow truck and get winched out of the ditch and it'll be fine. And he said it, he paid for a tow truck in cash and they came and pulled him out. But he said at that point that he knew he had almost been caught and that he needed to get rid of the children at that point. So the next day, we had talked about receipts. The previous receipts mentioned from the Bypass Food Mart in Greenville, Alabama at 8:18 a.m. and the Community Neighbor Bank in Camden, Alabama at 13:06 p.m., which would be 1:06 p.m. He had mentioned that they were with him at the food mart, but they were not with him at the community bank. So we had a pretty reasonable belief that somewhere in between those two, would have been the disposal site.
Let's not jump to the next day yet. I got a few more questions.
Sorry.
If that's okay. The idea with the wrecking of the car and that, the police officer, y'all weren't ever able to confirm that, were you?
We weren't. We tried, of course, to an extent. It's kind of like a needle in a haystack because I can't imagine that anybody would want to come forward and say, hey, I was that guy that probably should have arrested him for DUI and I didn't.
But Tim didn't seem to have any reason to lie about it.
But yeah, it was a story that didn't seem to serve any purpose one way or another. So we just I at least personally took it as a probable fact.
And at that point in time, you kind of get him laptops to try to help kind of figure out the area.
We did. He seemed convinced that if he got access to some kind of topographical maps or something that showed elevation changes, that he would be able to find the location on a map. Now, we're still looking at a pretty big search area.
And I think you might have brought him like an Apple laptop first, and he gets frustrated.
I think so. He got frustrated with the Apple device and specifically requested something with Windows or Android operating system. And I kind of remember joking with him about that because I feel the same way about Apple products.
But, did you,
Sorry.
okay, the Apple.
You don't like Apple products either.
No, I think they're kind of clunky.
And during this time, he would kind of have occasional outbursts, but you believe that those were appropriate emotional responses, correct?
I mean, for somebody who had just admitted to having killed their children and under the circumstances, I felt like some of his responses were appropriate.
And that's about the point in time that you realize, hey, the recorder's not on.
It is. We actually were planning on concluding the interview and realized that the tape recorder, probably the best interview we'll ever conduct, was not recording.
And so you record it and you start again.
That's correct.
Right, let's take a break right there. It's a good middle point of the interview. Step in the jury room. Don't talk about the case. Have you back out here in 10, 12 minutes.